Hi everyone, my name is Callista, and right now, I'm enjoying the single life. But once upon a time, I was married to a man named Theo. Sadly, that marriage, along with his parents, Beckett and Azra, made my life pretty hard. Even though Theo and I both had good jobs and earned well, his parents always saw me as someone just trying to take advantage of their son. This misconception was largely fueled by Theo himself. He constantly bragged about how fortunate I was to marry into his luxurious life, hinting that it was something I could never achieve on my own. Because of this attitude, his parents viewed me as some sort of gold digger. Theo's tendency to paint me as financially dependent on him led his parents to demand a prenuptial agreement before our wedding. Now, I wasn't completely against a prenup in principle, but what really hurt was how Theo didn't even talk to me about it. He kept the lie going that I was making far less money than him, which only made his parents think even less of me. To avoid embarrassing him, I didn't correct the false image he was spreading, and that only brought me more judgment and unfair treatment from his family. I stayed silent because I loved Theo, even though it was becoming more and more obvious that he didn't feel the same or respect me as he should. After he lost his job, he started living off my income, all while letting his parents think it was the other way around. I was growing more and more tired of carrying both of us financially, and his refusal to find a new job made things worse. The breaking point came when I decided to buy a house with my savings and some money I had inherited. I found a house I adored and bought it in my name alone, which Theo was not happy about. This decision made me stop and really think about my relationship, and it eventually helped me realize I needed to stand on my own. I had to remind Theo that he hadn't contributed anything financially to the house, but he continued to hassle me about it. What really pushed me to the edge happened one evening during a family dinner. Everything was fine, until his parents started asking about the new house. They seemed curious, but it was clear they assumed Theo was the one who had paid for it, considering how little they thought I was earning. We've settled into the new house just last week, and it's already furnished, so the move was pretty smooth, I said, trying to keep the conversation light and neutral. I hoped this would be the moment when Theo would finally correct his parents and give me credit for buying the house. But instead of telling the truth, he claimed that he had paid for the entire house with his financial success. His parents were thrilled, showering him with praise, and completely ignoring the fact that I had made the purchase. I looked at Theo, hoping for some sign of acknowledgement, but he avoided eye contact. I was furious, but somehow managed to keep my cool in front of his parents. I didn't want to make a scene, but as soon as we were alone, I couldn't hold back any longer. What was that, Theo? Why would you tell your parents you bought the house all by yourself? I demanded, utterly shocked at the lie he had just told. He tried to defend himself, saying that he didn't want to disappoint his parents by admitting that he had lost his job. I just wanted to make them happy, he said. You could have simply told them we both contributed to buying the house, I argued, feeling crushed by the betrayal. His claim of sole ownership was a huge blow to my pride, but Theo was dismissive, saying, "What's done is done," and that there was no point in correcting it now. He refused to tell his parents the truth, prioritizing his own pride over my dignity and our relationship. That was when it finally hit me. Theo cared more about his ego and avoiding personal embarrassment than he did about me or the truth. He was perfectly fine with letting his parents believe he was the sole provider while I did all the work. His refusal to find a job and constant pestering about putting his name on the house deed only made things worse. I started to feel like I was being taken advantage of, but despite all of this, I still wasn't sure what to do next. That indecision lingered until the next day when something happened that pushed me over the edge. I heard the doorbell ring, and since I was busy, I asked Theo to answer it. When he opened the door, I couldn't believe my eyes. His parents were standing there, suitcases in hand, ready to move in. They had somehow gotten the impression, thanks to Theo, that they were invited to live with us in the new house indefinitely. Theo welcomed them with open arms, playing the part of the generous son who had supposedly bought this big house and could now take care of his parents. They praised him endlessly, and he soaked it all in, leaving me speechless with anger and disbelief. My mind was racing. I couldn't believe how far Theo had gone with his lies. I had worked hard to buy that house, and now his parents were moving in, thinking it was all thanks to him. I reluctantly agreed to this arrangement, but the sheer audacity of it all made it crystal clear that Theo had gone too far with his lies. Even though I didn't want to cause a scene in front of his family, I knew deep down that there was no way I could let this situation continue. The idea of his parents living in my house based on a complete lie was something I just couldn't accept. At that moment, I realized that I needed to take decisive action to reclaim not only my home, but also my dignity. Navigating this situation required a delicate balance. I didn't want to explode, but I knew I had to handle this sudden turn of events with as much grace as possible. Meanwhile, Theo's parents were practically over the moon, excitedly talking about how spacious the house was. They kept going on about how cramped their previous home had been, and how lucky they were now to live in such luxury. Thanks to Theo. Each word was like salt in a wound, especially when they started discussing the 5 bedrooms and their eagerness to claim the largest one for themselves. "Let's hold off on choosing rooms for a moment," I suggested, trying to keep my tone calm. "I need to talk to Theo privately." Theo, sensing the seriousness of the conversation that was about to unfold, clearly wanted to avoid it. He nervously glanced at me, but refused to make eye contact. Instead, he tried to brush it off, suggesting we could discuss things in front of his parents. His attempt to deflect only made the discomfort worse. "If you're fine with it, Theo, we can talk here," I said, my patience wearing thin. At that point, I was done beating around the bush. "Theo, your parents cannot stay here. It's not happening. You didn't even ask me before making such a decision. How could you think this is okay?" Before Theo could respond, his mother, Azra, immediately jumped in to defend him. She acted as if the house was theirs to do with as they pleased, implying I had no say in the matter. Her boldness left me stunned. She even went so far as to hint that I should be careful not to get kicked out. It was like she didn't hear a word I said, and her demand to see the largest bedroom, as if I didn't exist, was the final straw. The situation had gone from a misunderstanding to outright disrespect. It became clear that Theo's parents didn't see me as a partner in our life together. Instead, they viewed me as an outsider in my own home. Their dismissive attitude, combined with Theo's willingness to let this happen, showed a complete lack of respect for me and for the basic values of communication and mutual respect that should exist in any marriage. I stood my ground, refusing Azra's demand with a firmness that clearly surprised both her and Beckett. As I stared at them, I couldn't help but think about who was really at fault here. Yes, their sense of entitlement was outrageous, but it was Theo's lies that had started all of this. If it weren't for his false promises and the deceit he had spun, we wouldn't be in this mess. But that didn't excuse Azra and Beckett's behavior. They had boldly walked into my home and even threatened my place in it, and I wasn't going to overlook that. Azra and Beckett, clearly caught off guard by my resistance, tried to insist that Theo had promised them the largest room and that they were already planning to stay. In fact, they revealed that they had even ended the lease on their old home in anticipation of moving in with us. "You've made a big mistake," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "There is no way you'll be staying here, especially under these circumstances." Their outrage was obvious. They insisted that my opinion didn't matter and that Theo would fix everything. They were so sure that Theo would get them what they wanted, which only made me realize how deep this deception ran. "You're mistaken, Azra," I said, taking a deep breath. "It seems Theo hasn't told you the truth. The house is mine, not his, and you won't be staying here." Their disbelief was written all over their faces. They accused me of lying, saying there was no way the house could be mine. I suggested they ask Theo for confirmation, hoping that finally he would be forced to come clean. Both Beckett and Azra turned to Theo, expecting him to back up his lies, but as they waited for him to confirm their beliefs, Theo was cornered. He had to choose between keeping up the charade or admitting the truth. The tension in the room grew as Theo avoided eye contact, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. It was clear he didn't want to confront the truth, but his silence spoke volumes. His refusal to meet his parents' gaze was a quiet confession that everything I had said was true. Finally, I offered to show the property documents to prove my ownership. "If you still don't believe me, I can show you the paperwork," I said firmly. The reality of the situation was slowly beginning to sink in for his parents, though they were still grappling with it. For so long, they had believed the story Theo had spun, that I was financially dependent on him and that he was the successful provider. Now, faced with the truth, they struggled to accept it. As Theo sat there refusing to speak up, the weight of his deception was undeniable. The longer he remained silent, the more it became clear to everyone that he had lied. The house was mine, and I wasn't about to let anyone, especially his parents, take that away from me. Theo's parents were convinced that given his previously high income, it only made sense for him to own the house. The stark reality of his job loss and dependence on my income was a shock they hadn't anticipated. I corrected them, pointing out that he had been out of work for over a year, and that I had a successful career despite the judgments they had made, based on surface-level assumptions. This revelation visibly stunned both Beckett and Azra, leaving them speechless. Theo, meanwhile, stayed silent, avoiding any confrontation as he continued to stare at the floor. His refusal to speak only added to the tension hanging in the air. Seeing Theo remain quiet, I decided it was time to end the awkwardness. I told Beckett and Azra that they needed to leave. I had already put up with enough disruption for one day. However, Theo finally found his voice, pleading with me not to throw them out, explaining that they had nowhere to go since they had already given up their previous living arrangement with the expectation of moving in with us. His plea put me in a tough spot. It wasn't just about enforcing boundaries anymore. It also became about the real-life consequences of Theo's lies, which now left his parents in a vulnerable position. They had been caught in the web of deceit Theo had spun, and it wasn't fair to them either. Still, I had to stand firm. "I can and I will, Theo," I said, my voice leaving no room for argument. "You made these promises without my input, offering them a place in my house as if it were yours to give." Theo, feeling entitled to a say in the matter just because he was my husband, argued that his word alone should be enough to let his parents stay. He tried to suggest that I had no choice in the matter. Azra chimed in as well, claiming that since we were married, everything I owned was now shared with Theo, as if the marriage erased my individual rights to the house. "No, Azra, you're mistaken," I responded firmly. "I absolutely can ask you to leave, and Theo, you'll be leaving with them. Since we're still legally tied, I'll prepare an eviction notice, and I won't stop there. I'll also be seeing a lawyer to start the divorce process." Theo's reaction to the mention of divorce was immediate and intense. His panic was mixed with anger, as if he had never imagined that I might go this far. In his panic, he lashed out, threatening to take half of the house and demand alimony, clearly hoping to scare me into backing down. "Really, Theo?" I asked, unable to hide my frustration. "Have you forgotten about the prenup that you were so eager for me to sign?" I reminded him of the agreement's conditions. Neither of us could claim alimony, and our individual assets, like my house, remained ours in the event of a divorce. The prenup, which he and his parents had pushed for, was meant to protect their future, never considering that the tables might turn one day. The reminder hit hard. Theo, Beckett, and Azra, who had been so confident in Theo's continued success, were now realizing just how deeply they had miscalculated. The gravity of the situation began to sink in, and with it, their earlier confidence crumbled. Suddenly their attitude shifted. "Maybe we don't need to rush into a divorce," Azra suggested, her tone now much more subdued. There was an air of desperation in her voice, a sign that they understood how bleak their circumstances had become. "Let's just sit down and figure this out," they proposed, hoping we could come to some kind of mutual agreement. Theo clearly still believed there was a chance to salvage the situation if we just talked it through, but I had reached my limit. I was done with the lies, the manipulation, and the way they had taken advantage of my kindness. "I'm not here to fix this for you," I replied, my voice unwavering. "I won't be used for your financial gain, Theo, and I certainly won't tolerate any more exploitation from your parents after everything they've put me through." Theo tried to brush aside his parents' behavior, downplaying their actions as if they weren't significant, but it was too late for that. I had seen their true colors, and I wasn't going to ignore the way they had treated me in my own home. Theo and his parents tried to brush off their past behavior, acting as if the issues from before were minor and should be forgiven. But the recent threat they made, trying to evict me from my own home, was something I couldn't just overlook. Their sudden shift to kindness didn't erase the tension that hung thick in the air. They began pleading for my understanding, thinking they could sway me the way they might have done in the past. What they failed to realize was that I had changed. I wasn't the same person they could push around anymore. The fact that they had canceled their lease, assuming they could simply move in with us, showed a complete lack of respect for my autonomy. I wasn't going to let them walk all over me any longer. As it became clear that Beckett and Azra had no intention of leaving, I took the next step. I called the police to have them escorted out. Their departure left Theo fuming, but I quickly reminded him that he would soon face eviction from my home as well. Faced with the reality of his situation, Theo's anger turned into apologies and regret. The rapid shift in his attitude was almost exhausting, but I felt relieved knowing that the nightmare was nearing its end. From that moment on, I made it clear that Theo was no longer welcome in my space. This was the final stand against the years of manipulation I had endured. Until his eviction was finalized, I relegated Theo to the guest room. With no other choice, he had to face the fact that his time in the house was over. Meanwhile, his parents, who had depleted a good chunk of their savings staying at a hotel, were forced to search for a new rental. Interestingly, they chose not to take Theo in when they found a place, which seemed like an attempt to hold him accountable for the mess his lies had caused. This created a noticeable rift between Theo and his parents. The relationship between Theo and his parents soured quickly. They began to blame each other for their predicament, and soon his parents withdrew their support for him altogether. It became clear that the only thing they had valued about Theo was his financial contribution, and now that he wasn't able to provide, they cut ties. Left on his own, Theo had no choice but to rely on the generosity of friends while searching for a job. As for me, I proceeded with the divorce. By that point, it was obvious that our marriage was beyond saving. Theo's behavior had shown a deep lack of respect and an ingrained selfishness that I could no longer tolerate. While he made attempts to reconcile, I was firm in my decision. I wasn't going to be used anymore. The divorce process moved fairly quickly, largely because we didn't have children. Within 8 months, it was finalized, and we were officially separated. During that time, I focused on rebuilding my life, finding my footing, and eventually even started dating again. Theo, meanwhile, continued to hold on to the hope that we might get back together, but that was nothing more than a fantasy on his part. For me, the chapter with Theo was well and truly closed. Story 2. I saw Matthew leave, with his sister Ella trailing him like a devoted pet. "It's your responsibility to look after Mom while we're away, Mia. Don't make a mistake." Without even turning around, he shouted over his shoulder. With my shoulders slumping for weeks, I exhaled deeply as the front door slammed shut. I dreaded the prospect of spending extended periods alone with Matthew's sick, quiet mother, Evelyn, who had made it plain that she didn't like me since the day I married her son 5 years prior. I ascended the stairs to her room slowly. Evelyn's wrinkled, pallid face was as blank as ever as she lay still on the bed. I muttered, not expecting a response. "Well, Evelyn, it looks like it's just you and me." Slowly, the first week went by. I fed her, bossed her, and changed her bedding as she gazed ahead without uttering a word. The quiet was deep, interrupted only by the odd groan of the old home. On the 7th day, something changed when I leaned down to adjust her pillows. Her skeletal hand sprang out and seized my wrist with surprising vigor. For the first time, her piercing blue eyes were alive and keen as I gasped and peered into them. "I've had enough of this act," she remarked in a hoarse voice, harsh from not speaking. "We have tasks to complete." My head swirling, I froze. Evelyn sat up, sliding her legs over the side of the bed with calm, confident movements. "How are you?" I stumbled. "I have been acting. Acting like a week-old woman to avoid having to cope with that unhappy family," she interjected with a little sardonic smile. She proceeded to explain, and as her words spilled forth, I could not believe what I was hearing. Matthew's betrayal ran deeper than I ever thought possible. I was very shaken by the labyrinth of deceit, brutality, and manipulation that Evelyn had been concealing. I started to feel a strong sense of resolve. I was always aware that they weren't typical, but this is crazy, I said, my voice growing irate. How could you have allowed them to treat you that way? Their mother is you. Evelyn's expression grew stern. They took everything away from me when I initially tried to oppose them. My wealth, my influence, and my honor. It was already too late when I noticed what they were doing. Hello? My icy eyes met his. That's why we have to stop them, Mia, before they do the same to you. I felt cold. Was Matthew planning to do that? All along? To isolate me? For me to become totally reliant on him and his family? My asthma flared up at the thought. Commence at the beginning. I stated my voice firm but quivering with rage. I need to know everything. And so she told me. She told a sinister tale of treachery and greed. The family had been split apart by her late husband's fortune, which was the beginning of it all. Together, Matthew and Ella gradually betrayed Evelyn in order to steal her money and take over her life. Bit by bit, they drained her of her possessions, driving her into a position where she had no alternative but to rely on them. As I listened, my blood boiled. The individuals I thought I knew were far worse than I could ever have imagined. But now, Evelyn and I had an opportunity to fight back, and I was ready. I saw Matthew go, with his sister Ella behind him like a submissive puppy. It's your responsibility to look after Mom while we're away. Don't mess it up, Mia. He didn't even glance at me as he flung over his shoulder. The front door banged, and I let out a deep sigh, my shoulders dropping for weeks alone with Evelyn, Matthew's sick, quiet mother, the same lady who had showed me nothing but hatred from the day I married her son. The days blended together until Evelyn's piercing blue eyes met mine for the first time one evening, as she seized my wrist with startling force. This act is enough, Mia. Her voice was steady but hoarse as she spoke. We have tasks to complete. Stunned, I gazed at her. Have you been acting? A little smile tugged at her lips as she nodded. Indeed, I pretended to be powerless in order to avoid having to deal with my unhappy family. It's time to fight back, though. The facts spilled out like poison as she spoke. While feigning to take care of their poor, defenseless mother, Matthew and his family had been depriving her of money, power, and dignity for years. My shock turned to rage, tears burning my eyes. Those bastards, I spat. Evelyn's voice was forceful yet calm as she grasped my hand. We must thus fight back. They won't see it coming. A strategy began to shape, the parts fitting together like a sinister puzzle. If Matthew and his family were planning something, we would track them down to Maui and stop them in their tracks. Evelyn claimed to know someone who could assist Nicholas, a former private investigator. Is he trustworthy? Evelyn dialed the phone, and I inquired. She flashed me a comforting glance. Among the good ones is Nicholas. He'll assist us take those snakes down. The call was short, and by the time she hung up, a mischievous smirk had crept across her face. He's in, she said. Seth had been anticipating some action. I let out a quick, startling chuckle. Who would have imagined I'd ever be part of a vengeance plot? If Matthew could see me today? The thought sobered me, but Evelyn noticed and squeezed my hand. I understand that it hurts, she remarked quietly. But we can't let them win. Her eyes became stony. They are mistaken to believe that we are weak. It's time to defend yourself. I felt a fire ignited by her words. For too long I'd allowed Matthew and his family push me aside. However, it is no longer the case. We were taking charge this time. Nicholas showed up 2 days later. When Evelyn introduced us, he was a man in his 40s, a little rumpled, calm, and with good eyes. I closely examined him, searching for any hint of dishonesty, but his kind smile and soft southern accent calmed me. I'm not worried, am I? Oh, he said. We will defeat those snakes that are lying. We immediately went to work. Nicholas was frantically phoning people and searching for information on Matthew's impending trip to Maui. Nicholas scribbled notes and whispered, Your husband loves his luxury resorts. We'll turn that against him, though. Evelyn and I leaned in close as Nicholas marked something on his notepad with a victorious grin. Got it. They are staying at the upscale Grand Wiley Resort, which just means they have more employees to buy off. Evelyn grinned. Fantastic work. Let's now choose a discreet way to get there. Nicholas covered everything in detail. Forged paperwork and fake IDs are necessary. We were prepared by the time Matthew left another pitiful message about extending their stay on the answering machine. I stood outside my small home on the morning we left, squinting into the intense Arizona sun. This house used to mean the world to me. Love. Family. A future. All that remained was a shell, a reminder of all the falsehoods I'd lived with a deliberate thrust. I climbed into the back seat next to Evelyn and threw my luggage in the trunk. She looked strong and unshaken, no longer the frail woman I had cared for. She was prepared for combat. As Nicholas pulled out of the driveway, I turned back for one final look at the home. It vanished into the horizon. A strange sense of finality washing over me. I felt like I was discarding an old, shattered existence and entering into something new, something stronger. No longer were we defenseless. We were prepared to engage in combat. As Matthew sat at the table looking dapper in a linen suit that shouted affluence, I kept an eye on his back. Ella draped herself in gaudy jewelry next to him, looking like a pampered aristocrat. And then there was the blonde. Lily had seen the same one by the pool. My blood boiled at her presence, but I made myself remain composed. This was not the time to lose focus. Evelyn and I walked over to the table. I felt her tighten next me. Years of treachery had led to this moment, and I knew she was barely holding back. I was grounded by Nicholas's steady hand on my elbow, his gentle support providing me the courage I needed. Matthew was the first to look up. His face twisted with confusion before shifting to panic, though he tried to mask it. "Emma," he stammered, his voice barely steady. "Why are you here?" I grinned, a purposeful, icy smile that stopped short of my eyes. "Oh, Matthew, I thought it was time for a small family get-together." My voice was calm, Cam oozing with just enough malice to make him quiver. Ella's eyes narrowed like a wolf, detecting peril, and her head sprang up. "What's this about Mia?" Her tone was stern as she inquired. Evelyn took a step forward, her voice unwavering and clear. "It concerns you, Matthew, and Ella, as well as the small plot you have been hatching behind everyone's backs." Matthew's face grew pale, his customary arrogant grin replaced with barely masked terror. "I have no idea what you're discussing." "Oh, don't play dumb, Matthew," I replied, crossing my arms. "We know everything. Your affair, your intentions to frame me, and your pathetic attempt to grab what's mine. Did you truly believe you would get away with it?" The blonde, obviously uneasy and perplexed, glanced between us. Ellie's lips thinned, her jaw tightening as she snapped. "You have no evidence of anything." At last, Nicholas, who had been standing silently behind me, moved forward. "In fact, we do." He dropped a manila folder onto the table with a loud thud. "Photos, recordings, statements of finances. It's everything here." Ella's face drained of color, and Matthew looked like he might be sick. I enjoyed seeing their painstakingly crafted falsehoods fall apart around them. I felt strong for the first time in years. "Unshakable. You're done." Evelyn spoke in a composed tone. "But I see you won't be able to argue your way out of this one." At last, Matthew's panic broke out. "You don't comprehend. That wasn't the case." I held out a hand, cutting him off. "Keep it, Matthew. I've had enough of your lies." Suddenly, the blonde got to her feet and grabbed her purse. "I'm not part of this," she murmured, casting Matthew a disdainful glance before walking away. It nearly made me laugh. Now, not even his mistress wanted to interact with him. With a low, angry voice, Ella turned on me. "You think you've won?" "It's not over yet." "Oh, Ella, it's over." I leaned in to make sure she could hear everything I said. "You've spent years tearing people down, but not anymore. You lose this time." I was given a phone by Nicholas. "Already dialing." Silently, he whispered, "Time to call the authorities." Matthew's face distorted with wrath. However, he was powerless to help. He had lost all control, and power. The truth was out, and there was no escaping from it. I felt Evelyn's hand close to mine as I turned to walk away. Her voice was quiet, but proud, as she whispered, "You did it, dear." I gazed back one more time, soaking in the image of Matthew and Ella, devastated and broken. This was long overdue justice, but at last I felt a weight drop off my shoulders as we stepped outside into the warm Maui night. For the first time in years, I was free. No more shadows, no more lies. Furthermore, Matthew and his family could rot in the mess they made. In my opinion, justice was ours, and it felt magnificent. Leaning back, I allowed the stillness to linger while the truth hung in the air like poison. Matthew sat slumped, his face pale and hollow, while Ella glared daggers at me. A tiny line of anger pushed on her lips. The previously haughty, manipulative couple suddenly seemed tiny, like toddlers caught in a lie. I looked over at Lily, as she struggled to comprehend the reality she had been forced into. Her test-streaked face turned pale. "I'm sorry you had to learn this way," I murmured gently, my voice calm and calculated. "However, you should be aware of the type of man you are interacting with." Stunned, she blinked and suddenly stood up. Her voice trembling, she said to Matthew, "I don't even know who you are anymore. I believed you were interested in me." Matthew didn't answer, didn't give her a glance. As if the walls of his well-constructed universe had suddenly collapsed, revealing him with a gentle scoff, he simply gazed blankly at the table. Lily turned and went away, slipping among the cluster of diners. The sound of her heels clicking against the marble floor was like nail sealing a coffin. Evelyn's voice pierced the quiet calm, yet razor-keen. "Matthew, I warned you that there would be repercussions." Her eyes burned with a fire I'd never seen before. Her son was the object of all her rage and strength. "I will not allow you to push me down again. You underestimated me. Am I too?" Ella started to object, but I interrupted her. "Don't even attempt it." I spoke in a steady but icy tone. "You think you can spin this around? Act as though you are the victims once more. It's finished. Talking your way out of this is not an option." Nicholas, standing discreetly behind me, placed the folder of evidence on the table. "Everything's here," he said. "The financial records, the conversations, the pictures. You two thought you were so cunning, but you left a trail of breadcrumbs anybody could follow. It will be easy for the authorities to make the connections." A deep rage simmered beneath the surface of Ella's face, turning it a mottled crimson. "You believe you've won?" Her voice was low and poisonous as she hissed, "Mia, you'll regret this." "Nicholas." My own words. I gave a faint, resentful laugh. "Ella, I believe I've wasted enough time regretting things. But you'll have plenty of time to regret everything." At last, Matthew's eyes were hollow as he looked up. "You don't comprehend," he murmured faintly, his voice shaking. "For the family, we took this action. For what Dad left behind." Evelyn's loft was like a sharp, merciless razor slicing through the space. "You dare not call upon your father's name!" She spit. "To see what you've turned into?" He would be embarrassed. Matthew sagged his shoulders and became silent once more, disheartened. I straightened. As if years of dread and rage were finally leaving my body, I felt a weird weight lift. "You've spent a lot of time twisting strings, believing that you have complete power over everyone and everything. However, you were mistaken." I spoke in a steady, composed tone. "You've lost." Evelyn stood from her seat with an elegance that belied her age. She put a gentle hand on my arm. "Let's go, dear," she murmured in a quiet but triumphant voice. I nodded, taking one final glimpse at Matthew and Ella. Slumping on their seats were two shattered individuals. They were exhausted from fighting for so long. They treated us like pawns. But now the game was over. As we walked out of the restaurant, the murmurs of the other diners buzzed around us. Rumors of scandal and incredulity. Let them gossip. I didn't care. There was no escaping the fact now that it was out. The warm Maui air embraced me outside like a new beginning. I turned to Evelyn, who looked stronger and more alive than I'd ever seen her. "We did it." Silently, I said, She smiled a slow, satisfied smile. Yes, dear, we did. And when Nicholas joined us, his eyes crinkling with calm pride, I finally let myself breathe. The war was done, and we had triumphed for the first time in years. I no longer felt like a victim or a pawn. It wouldn't matter how hard Matthew and Ella tried to put their broken lives back together. They now had to deal with the truth, which I was sure would follow them around for the rest of their lives. For my part, I was at last able to start afresh, stronger, wiser, and unafraid. As I looked over the broken remains of the Owens family, I felt a strange calmness come over me. The burden I had been bearing for so long, the hurt, hatred, and years of bitterness appeared to dissipate. In its place was a hollow sort of pity. These weren't powerful people. They were little depressed people who had ruined their lives by attempting to manipulate me in an attempt to get wealth and prestige. Everything was gone for them, their wealth, their reputation, and even each other. The return flight from Maui went by quickly. Sitting next to each other in the emergency exit row, Evelyn and I drank small bottles of bourbon while taking in the quiet. For the first time, there were no more threats lurking in the shadows, only the promise of a new beginning. Nicholas had assured us everything was under control. With his connections and the mountain of evidence we had gathered, the legal side of things would be handled. In the end, Matthew would be held accountable for his deceptions, plots, and betrayals. As for me, I didn't care about pressing charges or dragging it out in court. I was done fighting. All I wanted was to move on. Back in Arizona, the first thing I did was put the house up for sale. Finding a buyer didn't take long. Matthew's family had picked a property in an excellent location. I gave the keys to them. A twinge of melancholy was unavoidable. Observing the excited smiles of the new owners, I whispered quietly, "Try not to make the same mistakes I did with the house." Sold. Evelyn and I had to decide what came next. That evening we sat in a booth at a local diner, maps splayed across the table as we combed through apartment listings and thoughts for our fresh start. "Somewhere new," Evelyn murmured, her finger tracing the map. "Away from all this, a fresh start." I nodded, fully comprehending. The idea I'd once had raising a family in the suburbs, making a life with Matthew, was gone, ruined by his treachery. Perhaps it was time to move forward, to start afresh somewhere that had no ghosts of the past. "Any ideas?" I inquired. As Evelyn looked at the map, her eyes brightened. "You know, I've always wanted to see New England in the fall, the leaves turning hues, the fresh air. It looks like a lovely spot to start over." The image she painted of the two of us surrounded by red, orange, and gold-painted trees made me smile. Finally at peace, New England it is. I concurred. We focused on leaving Arizona behind throughout the course of the following several weeks. With each step, we looked for small towns in the Northeast, sold or donated what we had left, and considered employment opportunities. It grew simpler to let go of the past. On the morning we were supposed to leave, I took one last stroll through the deserted house. Upstairs, in what had been our temporary war room, I stopped. The walls that formerly contained photographs and maps, the instruments of our retaliation, were now empty. So much had happened here. Betrayal, anger, taking stock, but it was done. The past would stay where it belonged. A sad smile pulled at my lips as I turned away. New England has yet to realize what lies ahead, but this time I was ready. I vowed to face the future, with clear eyes and a bold heart. After everything Matthew and his family had thrown at us, I knew there was nothing I couldn't survive. I felt lighter than I had in years as I descended the stairs, released from the weights that had hung over me in the corridor. Evelyn awaited my arrival. Her expression calmed. Her smile was warm and perceptive. "Ready, dear?" she inquired. There was a quiet strength in her voice. I smiled back and said, "I'm not ready." Together, we left the shadows behind and walked out the door. The time had come to welcome the light. Story 3. There's someone in the home who spends all day lying in bed, and it makes the entire household feel dismal. The fact that she is unable to even care for herself is extremely annoying. I keep wondering how long this is going to continue. She basically sleeps all the time. Whenever my mother-in-law and sister-in-law see me, they begin to gripe. They have something to say all the time. Drew, whether Mark has a wife or not is irrelevant. they complain because she doesn't accomplish anything. If your wife isn't even able to assist, what good is having one? My father-in-law even joins them. Let me introduce myself. My name is Emily Brown, and I am 30 years old. I've been married to my hubby for 5 years. Life hasn't been easy for me. Shortly after my marriage, my father died of an illness while I was in high school. I also lost my mother when I was a child. I've always liked drawing. My goal was to work as a children's book illustrator. I attended a design school after high school, put in a lot of effort, and eventually got a job at a small design firm as an illustrator. I genuinely loved my job. We first met when my husband, Mark, who works for an advertising firm, came into my office to ask me to create a character for one of his projects. After dating for 2 years, we decided to be married. My sister-in-law was still living with my in-laws when we were married, so we moved in with them. At the time, it appeared to be the best choice. In order to balance my career and household responsibilities, I made the decision to quit my job and work as a freelancer. I wanted to be a good wife and took up most of the chores cheerfully. It wasn't too difficult, because my mother-in-law didn't enjoy housework and was fine with me taking over. She even told me to do things my own way. Nor was my sister-in-law very helpful. She was always out with friends or colleagues, seldom ever home for dinners. Nevertheless, at least initially, we all coexist peacefully and without any significant problems. But then everything was different. 3 years ago, I had a terrible accident. I went down the steps at a train station and sustained a major spinal injury. This injury dramatically ruined my life. I got paralyzed from the waist down. The shock was intolerable at first. I couldn't believe that I would never walk again. After 3 years, I've gradually come to terms with this fact. But it hasn't been easy. Initially, my in-laws were sympathetic and tried to help me as much as they could. However, they became impatient over time. They probably didn't think I would be better than for the rest of my life. To make things more complicated, my sister-in-law got married 2 years ago and moved out. I guess my in-laws assumed her leaving would make things easier, but it didn't. Now it feels like they're angry with me being here. I can sense their frustration whenever they look at me. Since the house is old and not designed for a wheelchair, I'm confined to my bed. Most of the time, I rely on a helper and a housekeeper to assist with my daily needs, like cleaning and laundry. They've been a big help, but it's not the same as having supportive family members. Despite the fact that I can no longer walk, I'm thankful that my upper body still functions. Because of that, I've been able to continue working from home as an illustrator. My employment offers me a feeling of purpose and keeps me occupied, which I'm glad for. At home, however, things have become challenging. After my accident, my husband, Mark, used to be incredibly kind and caring. Now he hardly talks to me and doesn't help at all. My in-laws, especially my mother-in-law, have ceased aiding with anything relating to my care. She always disliked housework, and now she's completely withdrawn from doing anything for me. My father-in-law, who recently retired, is home all the time, but even he doesn't bother helping. Only in the event that no family members who are physically capable are present, are helpers expected to offer physical support. But since my in-laws are both healthy and my husband works full-time, their involvement is limited. For the first 2 years after my accident, they helped a little here and there, but now they've stopped altogether. The atmosphere at home has grown cold. Everyone feels as though I'm a burden. I recognize that it's difficult for everyone, and I know they didn't anticipate having someone better than living with them. The emotional disconnect, however, is the most painful thing. The guy I believed I could trust, my spouse, has completely lost his mind. It's as if he's given up on me. I make an effort to be upbeat every day. I focus on my work and remind myself that I'm lucky to still be able to do what I love. On the inside, though, it hurts to be so isolated in a crowded place. I've already heard it all. Taking care of others isn't a man's job, according to my husband. That's his justification for not assisting me. In the meantime, my in-laws also do nothing for me. However, the rules prohibit the helper from performing duties that belong to family members. Still, the assistants noticed how bad my condition was and, feeling sorry for me, referred me to a housekeeper who could assist me with personal necessities. My in-laws weren't thrilled with the concept at first. "What a waste of money," they sneered. "Why would a housekeeper be necessary? What type of life of luxury are you aiming for?" I attempted to explain that I had no option. I won't even have clothing to change into if nobody does my washing. I stated I can't handle these things alone, but I'm not trying to take advantage of you. Their response was severe. They treated me as though I were a bother. My mother-in-law snapped. We don't have the funds to spend on pointless assistance. I chose to deal with it myself, since I was unable to argue with her any longer. Thankfully, I had continued my freelancing employment, so I was able to pay for a maid out of my own salary. Martha entered my life at that point. Martha was a 50-year-old woman without children who had lost her husband many years prior. She reminded me of my late mother, in some ways, kind, caring, and understanding. Her kindness provided calm to my otherwise frantic existence, and she assisted me with everything I couldn't manage on my own. I was a little happy for the first time in a long time. Naturally, though, my in-laws took advantage of the circumstance. As soon as Martha started working for me, they made an effort to persuade her to help them with their chores so they could do the cleaning and laundry for us. They demanded. Martha refused to back down. No, she said firmly. I'm here to look after Emily, not the entire family. Which type of housekeeper do you have? My mother-in-law snapped. You're really arrogant. Martha didn't back down. If you want me to perform your portion, it'll cost extra. Would you be prepared to pay for it? She answered quietly. This led to an argument, but secretly I felt relieved. Someone had finally confronted my in-laws and their unreasonable actions. This is how a year passed, with the helper and Martha being my only true friends. Then one day, my sister-in-law, Sarah, returned to the house. She had gotten divorced because her spouse had cheated on her. He's such an idiot, she said bitterly. He must have been seduced by another woman. In any case, he was such a bothersome nuisance. I had always thought her husband was a serious, devoted businessman, so I found her story strange, but I didn't want to cause any trouble, so I didn't share my thoughts. After Sarah returned to the house, my situation worsened. She started behaving precisely like my in-laws, attempting to make Martha perform her tasks. But Martha stood her ground again and refused. Sarah wasn't happy about this. What are you even doing here? Just taking care of Emily. What a worthless housekeeper for a useless woman. She made fun of us both. Sarah. Sarcasm did nothing but stoke the flames. My in-laws now had a new partner with whom to band together. They'd continuously remind me how useless they felt I was. You're simply a seasoned wife taking up space. Now that Sarah is returned, my father-in-law stated, this home seems cramped. Sarah is the only person we need here. My mother-in-law added her voice. You just doodle ridiculous images while lying in bed. Time and space are being wasted. Sarah would make the extra effort to visit my room and provide criticism, even when I made an effort to concentrate on my job. Her words pierced deeply and were sardonic and incisive. It was more than I could handle. I therefore made the decision to discuss it with my husband. Would you kindly advise Sarah and your mother to use their words a bit more carefully? I questioned him. His reaction broke me, even though they're often hurting me with their remarks. He stated bluntly, they're just telling the truth. By that, what do you mean? Stunned, I inquired. Well, you can't even do your own chores, he answered. You spend your entire day lying in bed. I'm telling the truth. I'm at work, I objected. I'm doing everything in my power to help. You're working from bed, though, he replied sarcastically. The work is simple. Unlike me, you are not burdened with commuting. I made an effort to clarify. I'm doing my best to be useful to everyone. I'm trying so hard. Perhaps, he answered icily. But the family isn't satisfied with you since you can't take care of the house. It's no wonder people believe you're useless. I was devastated by his statements. Do you really think that too? Quietly, I asked. Don't be so sensitive, he replied. Simply handle it. You can't thrive if you let every little thing annoy you. That chat made it plain my hubby didn't care about me anymore. He wasn't supportive at all. I recognized that my disability created problems, but I had thought he would at least try to comprehend my struggles. Rather, he acted as though I were the issue. Every day I wished I could walk again. I wished I could go back to the way things were before the accident. More than anything, though, I want my spouse would support me, care for me, and realize how much I was trying to achieve in spite of my limits. Instead, I was left feeling alone in a house full of people who considered me as nothing more than a burden. How awful and tragic my circumstances are. I'm so depressed. I then question whether my feelings are selfish. Do I need someone to take care of me, or am I asking for too much? I try not to cry when I think about these things, but occasionally, despite my best efforts, they still fall. I tell myself that this is the body I was left with after my accident. However, I've been making every effort to advance. I'm not going to be defeated by this. I force myself to keep going. I remind myself that there are a lot of people throughout the world who are dealing with problems that are even worse than mine. I can't help but feel lonely, though, particularly now that I don't have my parents to support me through this trying time. However, I persuade myself that perhaps this is a better option. What I'm going through doesn't have to be seen by my parents. They don't have to witness the suffering and hardships I face on a daily basis. However, it doesn't make the emptiness any less painful. There isn't anyone left in this house who can really support me. The suffering just gets worse. I have nothing to go back to. I began to question whether I could leave this place and start a new life with my spouse, away from all the negativity. However, my spouse said something so vile that it rocked me to my core before I could even bring it up. I initially believed that he was considering my welfare, and for a split second, I was pleased that he was concerned. My heart was broken by what he said next. "I believe they're correct," he stated plainly. "What are you saying?" Confused and a bit afraid, I inquired. "I believe that having a younger, healthier wife would benefit me more," he stated nonchalantly, as if it was the most normal thing in the world. "I want to have a child someday, but it's simply not doable with you." I felt like I was struck in the head by what he said. I was momentarily unable to grasp what he had just spoken, as my thoughts went blank. Because of my disabilities, my own husband was telling me that he wanted to replace me. I realized in that moment that I could no longer count on him for anything. "I couldn't hear anything else," he said, continuing his conversation. The only thing I understood was that he wanted a divorce. His words rang in my head, shattering what little hope I still had. Next came the insults from my in-laws. "You are of no use," they scoffed at it like a piece of trash. "Even if you are paying a maid, you hardly get any money back once she works for you. Nothing will be left for you. You're just a burden to us, a parasite that lives in our home." They continued after that. They went on to say that even helps don't labor for free. Additionally, you're squandering money on them. Simply leave. You're no longer welcome here. I was numb. After hearing the people's hateful remarks, there was no reason to stay any longer. I thought about family once. "I have to get out," I told myself. I didn't have a house to go back to, but I would find a new place to live no matter what. I asked my housekeeper, Martha, for assistance in finding a new residence. She was more than willing to help, and since everything is now so easily accessible online, managing the process was simpler than I had anticipated. Once all the paperwork was completed, I handed my husband the divorce papers. "Excellent." He smiled icily as he said, "At last, you decided on something. Don't blame me, though. Blame yourself for being like this." Even if his remarks were sharp, I refused to back down. "Do you think you'll manage without me?" I inquired. "Naturally," he answered with assurance. "I'll locate someone more suited to my needs. I should have a better wife, everyone says. Don't be concerned about us. We'll be all right." He continued by saying that they had enough money to live well for a time thanks to the settlement of Sarah's divorce and his retirement. "We don't need to depend on you anymore," he said. "Fine," I answered. "Do as you please." There was nothing else I said. Silently, I collected my belongings and left. Although the experience was painful, there were some positive changes. It changed everything for me when I moved into a wheelchair-accessible flat. I was able to walk freely because the room was created with large entrances. I could finally make my own food, something I hadn't been able to do for years, thanks to the spacious kitchen. Having a place that really fit my requirements felt liberating. Martha still assisted me, but she was no longer a housekeeper. Instead, she became my business manager. I discovered that Martha had been a prosperous businesswoman at a large corporation prior to her marriage. She handled my freelancing job with ease because she was quite tech-savvy. She told me she left her high-powered job years ago because the intense competition in her corporate environment had worn her down. She laughed and said, "I just had enough." So I ceased when I got married. I admired her strength and confidence. It made sense to me now why she was able to stand up to my in-laws without hesitation. Living on my own, I started to feel a sense of freedom I hadn't experienced in years. I could hire help for cleaning, laundry, and shopping, which offered me the support I needed without relying on rude family members. I had a renewed sense of control over my life for the first time. I had just started to feel optimistic about the future and get used to my new routine. Life has more shocks in store for me. My ex-mother-in-law began phoning me a lot after my divorce. I didn't see the need to speak with her, so I initially ignored her calls. There wasn't anything left to discuss, and honestly, I was enjoying my new life. Martha's support had been incredible, and without the constant drama of my in-laws, I was able to focus fully on my work. I just didn't have the time or energy to deal with her because my business was doing well. A year passed, and although I occasionally heard from Sarah, her calls had also grown less regular. My life had finally fallen into a quiet pattern, and I decided it was time to deal with my ex-mother-in-law once and for all. I took up the phone and called her number. "Hellos?" I said finally. "You've replied," she said, her tone immediately accusing. "How come you haven't been returning my calls?" Unsure of how to react, I paused. I was concerned something had happened to you, she said, her voice suddenly soft and sweet, a tone I had never heard from her before when we lived together. I became skeptical of her abrupt change in attitude. This wasn't the woman who had spent years criticizing me and calling me useless. I pondered whether she had suffered any harm. Was she in trouble? Was she aware of my accomplishment? "Well," I said cautiously, "I appreciate your worry, but I'm doing fine. You have nothing to be concerned about." "Oh, I'm glad to hear that." Although her voice sounded uncertain, she said. Then she went on, "By the way, Paul and I were thinking maybe you could come back and live with us like before." I went cold. "I'm sorry," I asked, unsure if I had heard her correctly. "It's impossible to be content living alone," she said. "I've been thinking a lot, and I believe that leaving a person with a physical impairment alone wasn't appropriate. Come back home and we'll take good care of you. Nothing will be a concern for you." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This was the same woman who had previously referred to me as a burden and a parasite. I firmly stated, "I'm doing great on my own. Martha assists me in organizing my work, and I have a helper who assists me with household duties. I don't require care from anyone." There was a pause, and then she changed the subject. "About your business. Are you really making more money than Mark?" I was surprised by her question, but I honestly said yes. I was making a lot more money by the time of the divorce. I'm earning close to $15,000 a month currently. Her voice got tense. Although Mark brought it up, I didn't believe it to be accurate. "After your accident, did your income cover our living expenses?" "Yes," I answered. I was initially providing the majority of the funding. Mark's pay had been reduced, and his company was struggling. I offered to help since he didn't want to notify you or Paul. He was scared you'd be unhappy if you found out his pay had been lowered. But after 3 years, he appeared to forget that I was the one paying for most things. When she didn't immediately answer, I went on. "Oh, and I am aware of the true cause of Sarah's divorce. It had nothing to do with her spouse cheating on her. She was to blame." "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice weak. "Her ex-husband contacted me," I explained. "He told me that Sarah had stolen his money and was using it to pay him alimony. He intends to sue her in order to get back the things she took as well as extra money." She was silent for a minute. I was unaware of that." At last, she spoke. "Well, now you do," I said. "And I also know about Mark's position. Didn't he fall in love with a girl from a hostess bar? He probably desired the divorce so he could use my wages to support her. Let me guess, though. He didn't pique her curiosity. To her, he was simply another marker." "How were you aware of that?" Her voice rose in astonishment as she asked. "I know everything," I answered. "I also know that Mark hasn't had a job since his company went bankrupt 6 months ago. He is unable to locate a job that he believes is suitable for him. So now he's just sitting around feeling sorry for himself." She didn't dispute it. Yes, that's true, she admitted. And after her boyfriend left her, Sarah returned. However, she brought with her much more debt. Paul's retirement money is entirely gone due of them. Our debt is engulfing us. I remained silent, allowing her words to fully register. Then she made a statement that really caught me off guard. If you come back, everything will be all right, she said, hopefully. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. By that, what do you mean? Sincerely perplexed, I inquired. Well, you can assist us in repaying the debts if you return, she said matter-of-factly. You're doing so great now, aren't you? Her nerves stunned me. The same woman who had evicted me from her house referred to me as worthless and urged my husband to abandon me. She now believed that I will come back to clean up their financial disaster. Not in my opinion, I said firmly. I have established a life for myself and will not return. You'll have to work things out on your own. Before she could say anything else, I hung up the phone. For a while, I sat there attempting to take in what she had said. The amount of change that might occur in a year was astounding, but their desperation didn't erase the reality that they had treated me brutally. I wasn't going to allow them to drag me back into their chaos because I was done with them. In a long time, for the first time, I was genuinely liberated. It's likely that Mark never thought his business would truly fail, but in hindsight, it appeared as though his negligence may have led to it. He never made plans or considered the repercussions of his actions. When I learned what had occurred, I felt a weird combination of feelings, regret for how things had ended out, and relief that I wasn't connected to him anymore. Lisa, my ex-mother-in-law, contacted me in tears one day. I would have known this would occur. With regret in her voice, she said, I would never have allowed you and Mark to get divorced. She obviously didn't regret losing me as a family member, though. The money was the main focus. That was her only concern. And to be honest, she had never given a damn about anything else. It was painfully clear from her statements that she was just thinking about herself. In contrast, Sarah had entirely abandoned any sense of accountability. I don't feel like working right now, she told me during one of her infrequent calls. She had apparently turned into a couch potato, gaining weight and wasting her days doing nothing but lounging about. My ex-in-law's predicament had gotten even worse. They had sold their former residence to pay off Sarah's debts. However, the house and make a lot of money. It was ancient and in terrible shape, and the expense of clearing the property was subtracted from the sale price. On top of that, the site wasn't appealing, so they got significantly less than they had planned. The four of them, Paul, Lisa, Mark, and Sarah, were now barely surviving in a tiny, low-cost one-room flat. Lisa wept to me over the phone, complaining about how hard their lives had become. We're working half-time jobs from dawn to night and we're so fatigued, she added, her voice cracking. Then she said something that made me unable to speak. You are alone to blame. None of this would have occurred if you had simply returned my calls. We wouldn't have had to sell the house. What are you saying? Sincerely perplexed, I inquired. You would have assisted us if you had been aware that we were selling the property, wouldn't you? You used to live there too. You must thus have some sort of attachment to it. I gave a sour laugh. Nope, I answered. She stumbled, obviously unprepared for such reaction. Her self-centeredness was unbelievable to me. Did she honestly believe I'd feel any kind of duty to aid them after everything they'd done to me? I was very happy that I had put off answering her calls for so long. I would never have agreed to such a foolish request, even if I had responded at the time. Lisa persisted in her appeal. Well, it seems that Sarah and Mark are now treating us like parasites, but we really need you. Please return. The only person we can rely on is you. Nope, I firmly responded. I'm no longer family. Don't depend on me. Don't say that. She sobbed. We apologize. Because of what we did, I apologize genuinely. I was completely unmoved by her abrupt apology. Instead, I started to get a headache. I made the decision to set them a deadline and put a permanent stop to the debate. I wanted to let you know something essential, Lisa, which is why I answered your phone today. What is it? She asked, her voice apprehensive. I will sue each and every one of you. Calmly, I said. What? Why should we give you money? You weren't even cheated on by Mark. He wasn't in a relationship with the girl from the hostess bar. she objected. "It's not for cheating," I clarified. "It's for the years of verbal abuse you inflicted on me, which caused me emotional distress." On the opposite end of the queue, there was stillness. I went on to say, "I have video and audio proof of all the nasty things you, Paul, Mark, and Sarah said to me. Every insult, every degrading comment. I've preserved it all." When I presented the proof to her, Lisa went into a panic. "What? You recorded us?" she stumbled. Then she immediately hung up the phone without saying anything further. I assumed she was worried that the conversation would worsen her situation. Maybe she was finally beginning to realize how guilty she was. I made good on my pledge and submitted a claim for damages via my attorney. With tears in her eyes, Lisa begged me to dismiss the lawsuit. I didn't care that she and the other members of my ex-in-laws were constantly complaining about their current circumstances. There was no way I was going to back down. Now that they had caused me so much suffering, it was time for them to pay the price. My life, meanwhile, kept going in a constructive way. An important step towards my goal of becoming a picture book author is being invited to illustrate a picture book. It seemed like a new beginning, an opportunity to start over on my own terms. I had experienced so much. Additionally, there were moments when the agony seemed unbearable. But despite everything, I discovered how to be resilient, have a cheerful outlook, and not take myself too seriously. I was resolved to take advantage of the bright future I knew I had ahead of me.